I wanted to really kind of get your perspective, really mostly about your transition from this early working with kind of analog hardware to, I mean, you still say you work with analog hardware, but
Yeah, I mean
more
now,
software now, right?
yeah, I mean now the kind of things I work with that are outside of the computer are different kinds of electronic instruments, some of which are digital, most of which are analog, or there's some kind of hybrid now. Also, I work a lot with building up different sorts of effects loops through an analog mixing board using different sorts of outboard gear that is centered around things you might call guitar pedals, but also includes other kinds of cottage built electronics like small synthesizers, small noisemakers. Um, what else? Radio instruments, small speakers that I can set up different sorts of feedback tones with to be able to create tones that could fall within the realm of something like a guitar, electric guitar sound. But anyway, so on the one hand, there's a practice of creating sound that comes from more of a hybrid or analog world, and then the actual sequencing and mastering I do inside of software now.
Okay, so I guess my number one question to start out with here is when you started in your career, was software really something that was available in any meaningful way, or were you still firmly in the hardware era?
Yeah, so when I started, it was 1993, and I volunteered at a community radio station. And so whether or not computer software was available, uh, for instance, in a bigger radio station, that was a bit irrelevant to me in this volunteer context. So uh, all I had to work with was reel to reel tape, cassette tape, carts, which were used to make small looping um, announcements for the radio and are modeled on the same technology as an 8-track cartridge. And towards the end of the 90s, we had mini disc players. That was the our little tiptoeing into the digital realm. And I didn't touch a software program for editing sound until 1999.
1999.
But
So,
but before that, people were certainly earlier than that. People were working with software in some capacity in the film industry, in a music department. If you were working on electroacoustic music, there would be some sort of software that one could use. Um, so in more specialized or institutional settings or corporate settings with significant financial capability, there was already software. But for those of us who were working as independent artists or in independent media, we were not working with software until the very late 90s.
so when you were starting out, were you aware of software really existing, or was it just like, and if you were aware, was it this thing that was just so kind of unachievable and kind of only available to professionals? Was it something you even thought about?
I mean, I didn't even think about having a personal computer at that point. I thought of a desktop computer as being a Windows machine that was useful for lists and the most basic version of email. Um, so I didn't have a good sense of the internet being a world yet when I first started, and I did not have a sense of what sort of software, for instance, the Canadian National Public Broadcaster would be using. I had no clue what that could possibly be. So I just walked into the radio station thinking very punk rock kind of thoughts, and I was thinking about playing records and recording interviews onto cassette tape and editing them on reel to reel. And I just took that at face value, like this is what's available. That's what you do.
So before I kind of like move into the digital age here, what like could you describe in any, I would say, way meaningful to you what it was like to work in those older physical mediums, like to actually have your hands on those devices?
Yeah, so there's two aspects that I feel like are actually very formative for the kind of art practice that I evolved and actually the way I still work now. First is that in the community radio station, we had an on-air booth, and then we had two production studios. And the production studios were technologically extremely similar to the on-air booth. So it had the same kind of board, mixing board. It had the same set of devices. We had the same brand of reel-to-reel player everywhere in the station. So once you'd learned how to use one piece of equipment, it was consistent across all of the production rooms. So the kind of reel-to-reel player that we had was only a 2-track, but we had 2 of them in the production studio. So that meant that you could mix something in 2 parts to 2 tracks, and then you could play them back together using the mixing board and record onto a third medium, so a cassette or a cart or something else, and thereby achieve a stereo mix from a 4-track situation. You could even add things coming from other devices. So I could sample from an LP, I could sample from a CD, I could sample from a cassette. I could use my voice live. So that was the advantage of having a production studio with a mixing board that has all of these channels. And so I would have this performative experience of putting a piece together. I would think about all of the different elements. I would prepare them all. I would do some dry runs, sort of rehearsal, and then once I figured out, okay, this is how I want to do this is the order, then I would literally start playback and kind of perform the mix. And if I didn't like it when I listened back to it, I would need to erase and perform again. So making a mix for me was entirely real-time performative. And then also working in especially reel-to-reel tape, it took me some months to get to be quite good at it, because initially you go out, you record an interview like the one we're doing now onto a cassette, and then you copy that by playing it in real time onto a reel-to-reel, which at our station we were mainly reusing and recycling older tape that we were getting for free from Deutsche Welle and from whatever the public broadcaster was in the Netherlands. Like, they would send us reels with sample shows or interviews, and we wouldn't end up playing those on the air, but we would recycle the tape. We would erase and recycle the tape, and then we would use it to make our own programs. And it takes a particular ear to, or it takes a certain amount of ear training before one can accurately edit an interview on reel-to-reel tape, because you play it back and you decide, where will I need to make a cut? I'll make a cut here. Do I make a cut there? So you listen for that spot, and then you need to stop the tape, rewind ever so slightly, and then by hand roll the tape across the head so that you can hear the sound and hear where a word begins and ends, and know precisely where you're going to draw the line with a grease pen on the tape, and then pull the tape out, literally take a razor blade, make the cut, make a second cut, and then maybe splice those 2 ends together, or keep the section that you've cut out, save it for later. I would often tape them to the wall with a tiny little arrow on the tape so I know which direction it was going. I mean, as I explain it, it sounds kind of simple, but it's actually pretty difficult because you couldn't see the waveform. You couldn't see, you didn't have instant playback of those little bits and pieces. They were just sitting on the wall. So I would need to have a system of labeling those fragments. I'd really have to keep the whole thing in mind, like, what are you working on? I would often transcribe an interview so I could kind of visually cut and paste where I was, figure out where I was going to make my edits, and then go in and actually physically do them on the tape. Because also, once you have cut and spliced that tape, it's difficult to go 2 steps back and reconfigure the tape or reassemble it if you've cut parts out. So the whole process becomes quite lengthy, and it also becomes really gestural when you're tuning into the precise spot where you're going to make a cut. So this act of scrubbing across the playheads was this very physical union of hand gesture, mechanics, and then my own ear becoming more and more attuned to what a voice or a word sounds like when it's slowed down to the point where I can decide where it begins and ends or where to make a cut.
That kind of relates to a question I had, which was, let's see, do you think there's like been any change in the intimacy you have with your work from moving away from working with it physically to just kind of, I mean, you still do some physical work, but do you think you have lost that intimacy in any meaningful way to you?
I feel like there are There are interesting ways that I have hung on to maybe an audible attention to repetition that came from spending hours and hours editing on reel to reel, and particularly because I edited interviews, like people's speech on reel to reel. For instance, I actually noticed last week at some point when I got up to get a cup of water in the middle of the night and I didn't turn the light on, I just used the same cup. If I'm just wanting like a small cup of water, I have the same cup sitting out. And I realized that I could just turn on the tap and I could tell when the cup was full by the sound of the water in the cup. And I knew exactly when to turn the tap off. And I realized I had been doing it that way for years because I've had this same cup sitting by the sink for the last 5 years. And it was an entirely audible cue that was telling me when the cup was full.
Interesting.
And I think this is related to having spent hours from, let's say, 1993 until maybe around 1997 or 98, editing mostly speech, but also some other kinds of sounds, just for hours, so that you play and replay, you play and replay. Like there's so much repetition to that editing process that one becomes really intimate with what's the sound of that word backwards, or what's the sound of that word when it's slowed down.
It's interesting that you say that, especially being that now I remember you saying on when you use software you use the scrub feature, but it seems to me like at least looking at tutorials, a lot of people don't.
That's right. Most people don't. They kind of gloss over it, but I think it's left there for oldsters like me.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think so. I want to move back a bit to your early career. Is when did you make that transition to software? And were you a late adopter, an early adopter? Did you just get it when it was available to you? Like, did you seek it out? Did it come to you? Kind
of. The opportunity to work with a digital editing system, so a digital audio workstation, which at that time was Pro Tools 2, I believe. It was offered to me. It's not something I was really seeking out. I had been merrily working away in these long-form analog modes, and I was offered a group residency with the Western Front, which is an artist-run center in Vancouver, British Columbia, that has a long history of media art as well as performance and video art. And so this was a residency organized by Peter Courtemanche, who was a good friend of mine from the radio station, and also someone who I still collaborate with to this day. And it was a group residency based around making audio pieces for performance and for an album, responding to a science fiction book by George Case called Silence Descends. And it was a piece about the collapse of the information age. And so, oddly enough, this was the moment where I switched over properly to working in software.
And so it was just because it became available.
It became available through this artist-run center. At that time, I had a computer. I had a desktop computer at home, but there's no chance that it could run sound software. It wasn't nearly powerful enough for that. And I still thought of that as being something that was too expensive for me to be able to do outside of an institutional setting. So I went to the Western Front many days a week and worked on my project there. And I didn't really get a lot of workshop or guidance. It was just like, here's the software and here's a manual. So I made a lot of mistakes early on, like erasing all my work and then needing to reconstruct it. So I developed all of these sort of paranoid habits of redundancy based on those early experiences. But I did still, for the album that we eventually produced as a group, one of the pieces I still made at the radio studio in a very analog way. And then the other piece I made using the software. And I guess I should say also that same year, so this was 1999, 2000, a little bit earlier that year, I had my first kind of international gig as a sound artist, and I went to Vienna, Austria to make a piece together with an Austrian artist at the National Public Radio in Vienna. And we had the help of an of an engineer, and he was working in Pro Tools, but we did also still use reel to reel for some of the loops and effects that that I brought, because I was still kind of in an analog mode. But I definitely saw the engineer working with Pro Tools, and in that setting, I was recording things and then sitting with the engineer while he was kind of doing the doing the cutting and pasting and managing the EQ and things like that, while I kind of watched over his shoulder and told him what to do.
So, was it makes it you make it sound like you were more ready adopter of it. Was there a lot of enthusiasm you greeted it with, or was it kind of more begrudging, like, oh, this is the thing that like I'm gonna have to work with?
No, I was excited to try it. I was frustrated too. I think this is why I can relate when my students start using a DAW and like Pro Tools or Logic and feel irritated with it. I absolutely relate to that. Initially, I felt frustrated with my own limitations or my own kind of slowness to understand the logic of the program, or for the program to not be as intuitive as I would have liked.
So that actually is a fairly important thing that I want to consider is so you don't think, necessarily speaking, then, that the tool was like really specifically made for you as someone coming from a physical space, like, or to what degree do you feel it was made for you?
I mean, it definitely had a number of, it had the same kinds of functionality mostly. Um, Certainly in terms of sequencing, like cutting, copying, erasing, duplicating, all of those things were much easier, and those were all things I expected to do with analog tape. And I could certainly do in software, and it was much more efficient. And I could also experiment with things and then change my mind and feel that I had more opportunity to make changes. It was also a lot easier to apply effects. And that's the main thing with working with analog tape, is that in order to kind of, in the setup I had at the radio station available to me, if I wanted to apply effects, I was really doing tape tricks, like figuring out how to ping pong sounds between two different tape players, or making loops and recording at one speed and playing back at another speed, like achieving things like pitch or drone tones or loops through physical manipulation of the tape. And that stuff is very fun, so I did enjoy doing that. And the software could do those things as well, and was maybe a little bit less satisfying, because it didn't feel like it was drawing on skills so much for me as just remembering a series of protocols. So.
All right. So, relating to what you were just saying, I think one of the biggest things, I think of at least, that I feel like software brought to people is that I can imagine being back in those days where you have like a lot of limitations because of what you're physically working with, and wishing that you could do things and being kind of liberated from the physical medium by software. Like, you said there is this amount of like loss of your kind of more physical relationship with it, but I imagine like it eases workflow to a great degree, and also I imagine there's many things that you couldn't do.
That's right. I think it expanded my imagination of what I was able to do, and this is maybe more speaking to the context of me being a completely independent artist in this sense. I wasn't enrolled in a university or in an institution that was teaching me how to work with sound, and so I also had no access to those kinds of resources. So in Canada, that I really owed my evolving career to volunteer-based organizations like a community radio station and to an artist-run center, where they would have equipment and opportunities available even when I was broke. So, but I don't feel like I was aware that I was missing out in the way that one might be, because I didn't imagine for myself a career, for instance, like doing sound design for major film. That wasn't really my intent. My intent was much more especially in the beginning, it was actually really focused on the circumstances of transmission and of the configuration of a radio studio and how to engineer a kind of subterfuge of that by using small transmitters and moving the whole FM exercise out of the studio and away from broadcast and licensed radio. So I was really wrapped up in the affordances of that kind of small homemade equipment, and I would also say I don't think I really had the imagination to know what I would do with a more complicated system. But my kind of conceptual intent was to, again, work with the circumstances of transmission and broadcast. And so I learned how to build a small 2-watt FM transmitter and figured out how to turn that into a key part of a performance or a sculptural installation. And then I slowly learned how to use software in various contexts until I could create more and more complex pieces. But I didn't start off thinking, oh, I want to know how to, do the sound design for like an action film. And so then I wasn't frustrated with the limitations. I was much more like, okay, here's this very limited palette of things. How can I conceptually think through an idea about radio or about transmission or about the system of recording just based on this very basic set of technical circumstances that are in front of me?
So you're saying that your work was more kind of, your pre-digital work was more kind of based around what you had access to rather than having an idea and seeking out the ability to do it.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And also I should say that what I had access to at a community radio station was also, a signal that covered the entire city of Vancouver.
Interesting.
And so I was really interested, my fundamental interest was that relationship of sitting in a studio somewhere and being audible to all of these unknown other people out in the world. And then trying to figure out, how do I understand that distance that also has such familiarity? Because I not only had my own regular show, but after a while I filled in for other people's shows. After a while I was the program director at the radio station, so I shaped all of the programming. I did the technical training on all the analog equipment. And so I felt like I was embedded in the radio station at a certain point. Like I practically lived there. And I was on late at night, I was on early in the morning, I was on in the middle of the afternoon. Like I was on the air all the time, and my voice became very recognizable to people. So if I went out and about and did things, and people would be like, oh yeah, are you on CITR radio? Yeah, I hear your show all the time. So that was not the same as seeking out software, but in fact I had been given a massive technological circuit of relations through being sort of more and more deeply embedded at a radio station.
So considering that then, that you were kind of, I don't want to say limited, but your inspiration went as far as your the availability to you. Do you think that your kind of creative horizons were expanded by your introduction to software then, it giving you more tools to work with, essentially?
Sure. I do think the software definitely did that. Not so much. Let's say that there was an initial learning curve of getting to know a digital audio workstation, and after that initial moment of learning Pro Tools, then I moved out to Montreal and worked with a bunch of other DAWs that actually never, I don't think are even functional anymore. I mean, I was at Concordia University, and one lab had one piece of software, another lab had another piece of software. So, but I think I was very software agnostic because having come from analog edit, I already had a mental workflow. I already had an understanding of what I would be able to do. So I wasn't very pinned down to one software or another. And I just slowly glommed on to Pro Tools because every time I went to work in a more professional studio setting, so for instance in these different national public radio studios around the world, everyone had Pro Tools, and I just thought, well, there's no reason to work with something else, then I should just work with Pro Tools.
Make a note for myself here, but if you can answer this question as well, do you know why that was? Like, why was Pro Tools adopted early? Because of, do you think more of a push from the company, or because it was the best available software?
I'm actually not totally sure. I think it might have been the best available in terms of its ability to uh, work with film sound, and it had proprietary hardware associated with it, which was one of the downsides for a long time. Like you had to buy an M box or a piece of DigiDesign hardware to go with the software.
I was surprised looking into actually getting a license that they still do make quite a lot of hardware.
Yeah, yeah, they do. But at that time, it was required. Like you couldn't fire up the software unless you had attached the hardware.
When did it first become available, just as like purely a like computer program?
That I'm not sure.
Do you remember when you first had it available to you at your home? Did you need the hardware at that point? Or?
Yes.
Interesting. So you took the initiative to get that hard. Was that?
Yes, that was when I moved to Montreal. I started doing a master's degree. I spent the first year working in the computer lab at school, and I was like, "This is nonsense. I've had enough of this. I am now going to invest in a new laptop, and I'm going to put a version of Pro Tools on here that's going to do some work for me." So I can't remember what commission I had. I had some art commission. I put the entire artist fee to a laptop and to Pro Tools and some hardware.
Do you know when that was?
That would have been 2001.
Okay. And so you said you can't like quite remember when it dropped the hardware, but
yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I feel like it's at least 10 years ago that we started having the little dongle. I think, yeah, it's probably 10 or 12 years ago, something like that.
Going back to you saying that early on there were actually quite a few DAWs, right?
And there still are, but there were just a whole bunch of random ones. I can't even remember the brands or the names of them anymore, but when I was in a university lab, they had all these different ones. And even in the same university, there would be 3 different DAWs in 3 different labs.
So back then, would you say that those softwares were more or less similar to each other than they are now?
Well, some of them were less complex. And the thing about Pro Tools is that you could use it simply, or you could immediately scale it up and do complex things with it. And some of these other DAWs, you could not scale them up. They were just simple. So they were sort of like a proprietary equivalent to Audacity, for instance. So there'd be a limited number of tracks, there'd be limited plugins. You might not have automation, for instance. So there'd be different features that wouldn't be there or wouldn't be very effective. Whereas Pro Tools had a very consistent structure, very consistent scaffolding. And even now that some things are, instead of regions, they're called clips, but it's all in the same place. Like the layout is the same. All of the routing capacities are the same. Pro Tools has taken a little bit of influence from things like Logic Pro, but it still really is intact in its own way. Like it hasn't radically changed.
So this kind of leads into one of the key things I wanted to get at with this project, which is the idea of skeuomorphs. Are you familiar with that concept?
No, tell me.
So it's a skeuomorph, probably the most obvious example that I think a lot of people understand is the floppy disk as the save icon on computers to this day.
Oh, right, yes.
So it's this legacy of hardware lasting into software. They even exist physically, like the flame-shaped light bulbs and things like that. So I really want to ask about the skeuomorphs that exist in DAWs. Like, what legacies of the physical workspace have survived into the software? You've already said scrubbing is one.
The scrub tool is the most obvious one, because it's designed to imitate this action of scrubbing the tape across the playhead on a manual setting, as opposed to being run on the at the speed of the pickup reel. So that's an obvious one. I guess it's somewhere in the plugins. The plugins tend to have some relationship to the old analog system. So even just the idea that you would, for instance, want to reverse a file, this is something that is completely standard practice if you're working with tape. It's one of the most obvious ways that you can manipulate sound. some of the plugins are designed to imitate very particular guitar amplifiers, for instance, or particular kinds of distortion. So telephone distortion, radio distortion, um, different sorts of noise is sometimes designed, like on a plugin or as an additive, is designed to relate to like a earlier existing kind of technology.
Like, I think I'm trying to remember. I read something a while ago about this culture that used to exist around making pedals for like different, like a lot of people who went into electric engineering, specifically in the realm of like working on audio hardware, got their start like as teenagers, like building custom pedals for
Mm-hmm.
people. So,
And yeah, for a while I feel like there were some major companies that you were buying things from, and there were some independents, but it was a little more dominated by the obvious ones like Boss or Electro Harmonics or whatever. And maybe about 10, 15 years ago, there was this huge boom in a kind of folk tech, let's say. So there was a cottage industry of people building modular synthesizers, but then also just building out all sorts of like quite eccentric electronic devices that are in the world of synthesis, but they might not be patchable, they might be touch sensitive, they might have a lot of different sorts of functionality that were designed around a particular set of alchemical symbols on the surface of the box, for instance. Or and then kind of following that, there was a huge boom in people building new, essentially guitar pedals, but knowing that a lot of people would use them not necessarily with a guitar, but might use them in the way I do, like on a tabletop or plug in, completely other sorts of instruments.
and how much do you think that culture of kind of building these specific, because I believe, I haven't used it personally, but on DAWs I believe you can get custom plugins, right?
Yes.
So would you say like that's kind of a surviving descendant of that culture of making custom hardware, the cottage industry?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, I think what happened is that for a while there were a lot of people working on plugins, and then that energy moved over to other kinds of software that are more built around coding, like Super Collider and Max MSP and Pure Data, where the user codes, builds their own effects or their own, I need an oscillator. Okay, I code it over here. I'll make exactly what I need with exactly the parameters I need. So that's kind of how Max MSP works. It makes these sort of objects, and then you're not like sitting there necessarily typing lines of code, but you could. But then if you work in Super Collider, you are actually typing lines of code in order to come up with different sorts of effects. So I feel like at a certain point, rather than creating plugins to deal with the proprietary software, independents move that energy over into these other modes that are not digital audio workstations, but are more like platforms for more plastic kinds of audio manipulation. And so, yeah, Max MSP is the proprietary version. Pure Data is kind of its open source relative, or parallel, let's say. And then, Super Collider, Kaima, and others are all other kinds of software you might use to design exactly your own effects system or your own kind of set of.
Are those very old softwares, or are they maybe a more newer thing built to kind of fill in this gap of no longer most people really having ready access to hardware like that?
I can't remember the when Max MSP starts. I should know. Actually, I have a friend who used to work for them, and the fellow who invented Pure Data is in California. I met him at a conference not long ago. But I don't have that ready at hand. But I'm sure this is like Wikipedia will give you the answer really easily.
Yeah, it seems like an easier one to find.
Yeah.
And again, to that subject of skeuomorphs, have you seen any change over time in a presence of them? There's Apple, for instance, is a really good example of a company that's shed a lot of their skeuomorphs. The Apple operating system has more and more over time been built to be more sleeker and minimalistic. And I'm wondering if that's the same with any softwares. I've noticed that when you use it and you've done demos, you have a lot of these like representations of the physical space, like dials and sliders. Is that something you turn on or something that's there by default? Have you seen like the availability of those things change over time?
I mean, Pro Tools has always had the edit window and the mix window, and the mix window really does look like an analog mixer. It is designed to look that way, and Logic and others also have that view, and those definitely do refer to like a hardware surface mixer. And for instance, the new lab we've just built down for film and digital media down at the West Side Research Park, the new social documentation lab that the grad students will use, has a fancy studio that also has, Pro Tools Ultra or whatever it is, and it has, a proprietary like hardware surface that is a sort of digital multi-channel mixer for being able to manipulate Pro Tools in a physical sense. And of course, it's new in that it takes it has a different kind of software background or backdrop. 20 years ago, you would have seen that, instead of having it like a digital mixer where each channel it can be any number of layers of channels. Earlier, it would have been just like a single large analog surface where one channel is one channel. So it's not that there is an evolution here, but there's still a consistency around the need for something that is a mixer, and the design of a mixer hasn't really significantly changed.
Absolutely. I mean,
in the last 70 years, because it's a good design. It does the thing you need it to do, and everybody needs. It's useful for us all that we recognize, like, okay, here's the slider. Here's where Unity is. Here is where I, have the trim for each of my channels. Here's where the EQ is. Like, there's the fact that those things are consistent across like a lot of different software and hardware configurations makes it just easy for a sound professional to adapt to any number of working environments.
So really, what's changed primarily is really just the availability of tape, like the physical workspace, all the hardware. It's still there more or less, especially for professionals. And
it's pretty rare that people work in tape anymore. It's much more of a kind of legacy sound and a legacy approach. So, for instance, the Hotel to Tango, which is a kind of infamous post-rock recording studio based in Montreal, where bands like Godspeed You Black Emperor and others recorded their albums, and they do not only work in tape, but they kind of have it as a significant part of their their appeal, is that people who do want to record an album onto analog tape can do it there, and people know how to do that, and they have a machine that does it, and they know how to service that machine, and they know how to make interesting things happen if they use this 24-track tape machine.
Because that's another thing I keep thinking of is just now, kind of listening to a lot of things that you're saying, is this idea of the language surrounding all these technical ideas. Is I always think about how rewind has become a word in our culture that just it's synonymous with go backwards.
Mm-hmm.
But it literally comes from the act of rewinding a tape.
That's right.
And for instance, you always bring up tracks, and that's like standard language for dealing with not just DAWs but also video editors to some extent. What is that referring to specifically? And can you think of any other kind of examples of just standard nomenclature that refer to old physical media that isn't really used anymore?
Yeah, I mean, a track is definitely what you would have on a on tape, and that's because you could have a tape machine where you have mono, so it's just a single track, or if it's stereo, then that's technically two tracks.
And does that refer to like a specific like physical track that the tape is running through?
It means that the tape, which is a long horizontal thing with I've got like celluloid with magnetic filings organized on top of it. Mm-hmm. When it cruises past the record head on a tape recorder player. When it goes past the record head, you can see on that record head that it's literally segmented into two parts. And it's got two little magnetic spots. And so one of those is associated with right and one is associated with left if it's a typical stereo recorder. So you can physically see it on the record head, and then you can see it again on the play head. And that is like a physical piece of metal that is sending an electromagnetic signal. The tape rolls by, and so when it's a record, it's like imprinting that tape with that information. When the tape then rolls by the playhead, that information gets turned back into an analog signal eventually. Well, it gets, it goes through the circuit, and then when it hits the speakers, it becomes an analog signal, and you can hear it as a, like an acoustic event.
Are there any other examples that you can like readily think of other than track and rewind? I'm sure there's tons, but also I imagine it's kind of something that's hard to think of because those translations of language, they happen very naturally, so it's difficult to really realize that, like, oh, that's referring to like the car being short for carriage is a great one. No one ever realizes that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I think these things are very naturalized. Like rewind and fast forward, these are all related to tape. I guess there are elements that are related to vinyl in particular. I mean, even just having the idea of the flip side. Well, on the flip side, that means turning the record over.
That's I've never realized that before.
Yeah.
Huh. All right. If you can give me a minute to the systems that you came up with when you were using physical media. So you say the system that you have of actually like keeping track of things in your workflow, essentially. Like, do you think that has translated substantially to software at all, or did you have to kind of reinvent your workflow?
I had to reinvent my workflow to some degree.
And do you think like software eases that? Like, another big question here is like, how much did it force you to learn it, and how much do you think it was built to ease you into it?
That's a good question. I feel like the push and pull went in both directions. On the one hand, there was a lot of payoff to working in software. I could do I could much more quickly and easily build these like large multi-track pieces. And so, just in the 2 years, let's say the first 2 years that I was using tape, I was just sort of slowly getting the chops to be able to do interesting things. And in the 2 years that I got used to using software, maybe in the first year I was still half the time using the radio studio as my crutch and kind of going back and doing it in an analog way just because I knew that better. And again, more it was the use of the production studio mixing board and that kind of performativity of queuing up all the parts and then playing them and doing the voiceover live, like while I was playing all of the other elements. I eventually worked my way out of that and got used to recording my voice completely separately, recording other elements or mixing them all in the software, and not having this moment of mix down as a live performance. But so yeah, in the first 2 years that I was using software, definitely I made things that were much more complicated than what I was able to make in the first 2 years of working with tape. And that was partially because of the limitations of the studio that I was working in with tape.
And you think those softwares, they made it easy for you to do that?
Sure, yeah.
And were you think because they were just because of their inherent accessibility, or do you think they were really geared towards professionals already in the field?
They were designed, I think, towards professionals already in the field. Like the things that I was used to asking a tape player to do, I knew to ask a piece of software to do it. If I had just been starting with the software and absolutely no experience in the radio station, I don't know, maybe it would have been different. But I already had a set of expectations around what I would want some form of editing configuration to allow me to do. And it didn't take me long to be able to understand, oh, I actually have all of these options. Let's start using those. So, but I guess the thing that I missed is I missed the uniqueness of some of the sounds and some of the results that I had from working in an analog way. And that's part of the reason I think that I still produce most of my sounds outside of the computer, and I just load them in later. And you still use a DAW mostly to do sequencing and mixing, and I don't use it to substantially create the sounds that I'm making. I do that almost entirely with hardware.
I think you're kind of compared to a lot of people who've made that transition, you're at a bit of a luxury with that because you can still like easily make work in that medium. Especially you said about the recyclability of tape.
Yeah.
You can make work very easily in that medium and translate it into a digital one and still have that. You know, people. I always think of this. Like film, for instance, is they still shoot things on film, but no one edits on film anymore. I believe it's always translated to a digital intermediate for editing. There's a quote I remember from David Lynch where he was waxing nostalgic about like the smell of the treating rooms for film. And I always think of that kind of thing about these kind of lost physical workspaces of what do you miss? But it seems like, is there anything you miss? Like, is there anything kind of permanently gone, or do you still have access to all the old hardware?
No, I don't have access to the old hardware. I mean, I did for a while. I had, well, I was at different radio stations, and so I could always use the reel-to-reel players there. And then eventually, all the stations I was involved with, they got rid of those players. For a while, when I would do special projects, particularly in Austria, just because for whatever reason, through this long-running radio art program called Kunstradio, I have been making commissions for Austrian radio for, since 1999, so basically 25 years. And so I was there last year and the year before working in their studio, and I was able to still use reel-to-reel if I wanted to there. And they have these beautiful Studer machines that are just like so pretty and so like so smooth, so easy to edit with, like just the most top of the line version of a reel-to-reel player. The ones I used at CITR were Revoxes, and I was always kind of fond of those because that's what I had learned on. And at one point in Toronto, when I was doing my PhD, one of the universities I was associated with, which is now called Toronto Metropolitan University, they were selling off their old reel-to-reel players. And so I got an Otari 4-track that was built onto this huge piece of wood, kind of like a wood stand. So it weighed about 75 pounds, was completely unportable. I got it for like $40, and it had just been re-engineered and all of the various parts like updated and so on. So it was kind of ready to go.
$40.
Yeah, it was crazy how they were just trying to get rid of it, and I got wind of it through some friends, and I scooped in and got one.
Do you still have that?
No, I do not, because it was very hard to transport around. I moved across many cities around North America, and so I just couldn't be moving that anymore. So I did use it for a couple of projects, and then I left it with a friend of mine in Toronto who's a sound artist who has a particular piece that's all about the disintegration of reel-to-reel tape. And so I was like, this tape player should go to the cause of this piece of yours, and you can use it as a backup. So that's where it went.
Machine's still alive and kicking.
It's still alive. It's Andrew, as far as I know, Andrew has it, and it's in, he uses it as part of one of the machines for this installation.
Wow.
But what I did find, though, is I did start buying online some things like these transistor reel-to-reel players, which are very small, and they're totally unprofessional. It's like a consumer-grade thing. It's kind of like what would predate a cassette player. And, maybe in the early 60s, you would give it as a present to someone in the family and be like, hey, you can record a message and then mail it to me, and then we'll have, like, grandma's voice on the tape. And it just has a motor on the pickup reel, which means that if you do any splicing of the tape, it's going to knock that recording out of pitch because the speed isn't being kept consistent across the playhead. So on a professional grade player, you have a motor on both reels, both sides, so that the tension is completely even. But if it's only on the pickup reel, it means that when there's less tape, it's running faster, and when there's more tape, it's running more slowly. And so as soon as you change the relationship of the recording to where it is physically on the tape when it was recorded, you're going to change the pitch.
Interesting.
Which makes it a very fun thing to glitch around with. And so I started buying up some of those when I'd see them at garage sales, or I'd find them on eBay for no money, like less than $20. Almost always there'd be something recorded on it already because someone would have given it to their family member. There'd be like 3 messages, and then they would have thrown it on the garage shelf. And it would sit there for 40 years until there was an estate sale eventually. And then someone like me would buy it. And so I've sometimes used those in just to sort of generate some interesting sounds, using its limitations, using its instant glitchability. Mostly this ability to pitch something up or down without having any digital artifact. That's the thing I love tape the most for, is this seamless, beautiful pitching.
So it's in a sense, you mean like kind of more, I don't want to say more organic, because that's a word that I think is kind of misused a lot when talking about these old hardwares, but definitely, yeah, less seamless, more smooth. I think that's what I always think about with digital things, is it's always so, you can always tell it's digital if it breaks, and with
Yeah,
analog stuff it's much more difficult to tell.
that's right. It's because you can take the tape and you can do other things to it. Like you can be like Lee Scratch Perry and you can take your tape recordings of your songs and you can bury them in the ground, in the soil for months, and then dig them back up and then play them. And take those little imperfections, little gritty bits and pieces as part of the sound. Um, there's a British sound artist, Mark Vernon, who does a lot of this. He also buries tape and then digs it back up, and he'll treat tape in different ways. And also another fellow, Harold Shelnick, who goes by the name Hars Media, like HARS Media, and he has this massive collection of just like the little bits and pieces of cassette tape you used to find just like flapping on the street or attached to it would just be like caught in a fence. Because
I still see those sometimes.
yeah, so he was the person who would collect all of those, and then he would digitize them and save them in this massive archive of all these tiny little fragments of tape.
That sounds interesting.
It's super cool. It's still up online, and that was kind of his side obsession for a while, was to keep this archive, and then he would do some performances related to that. So it's this inscrutability of this material medium that you can get your hands on and do things to. And in software, you can't bury it underground. You can do other things, though, especially if you're someone who's good at coding. Then you could work with something like Super Collider and really build your own, like precisely to your own specifications, different kinds of functions.
So that's something I think of too, is that the notion of, it seems the means for creativity have shifted a little bit from, I mean, it's still very geared towards people who are primarily creatives in the area of audio. But if you want to really get in there and change those tools, that used to be something you had to do physically. You'd screw around with, a tube or something, and now it's a line of code.
Yeah, that's right.
And
I think that's just generally true. I mean, especially as AI becomes more and more of a thing, it's like, do you manipulate code? Do you manipulate the AI? Like, how do you work with it?
There's a emerging career of people who just really know how to make the prompts for it.
That's
even.
right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. I mean, I feel like my superpower from working in radio all those years and then being interested in and kind of honing an improvisational practice with other people and with devices is that I'm pretty unafraid of sitting down on stage with like two objects and making a show out of like the sound of a pencil and eraser and a piece of paper. And I don't know that I would have that. I don't know if that's a skill that I would have honed if I had been immediately introduced to software. I feel like that's something that the analog circumstances of the radio station taught me.
I mean, you more or less kind of just answered this question, but if you want to elaborate at all, I wrote this down as a quote, and I'm not sure who said it. I'm about 90% sure it was you, but it was, I believe you said, the conditions of the medium create what people want to work with, which was, I thought, something that very much applied to this project, but that's kind of more or less what you were just talking about with the nature of tape and what you can make with it. But if you have anything else that you think would be...
I think because the way that, as an artist, I was always seeking out my medium. I didn't see myself as a visual artist, although now I'm also a visual artist, but when I was younger I didn't see that was a possibility because I didn't draw and I didn't paint, and those seemed like precursors to that sort of practice. And I didn't play a musical instrument to a high degree of expertise that would get me into a music department at that time. This was in the late 80s, and I just wasn't exposed to, a more interdisciplinary or contemporary experimental kind of media art world. Like, what I was exposed to was on the radio, and it was punk and noise and montage, like cut up tape and collage. And so my initial forays into making my own sound and radio art, I was really out kind of foraging for sounds and then putting them together in different ways. And then after a while, using the tape machine and using all of the various equipment in the studio, I started to understand that it wasn't only about helping me to organize the sounds I had brought in, but I could actually generate a lot of sounds just from the studio itself. And so at that point, things started to commingle, and it was like, oh, I could actually be making the sounds, not just sampling from other people or sampling from the world by doing field recording. And my field recording at that point was also pretty basic because it was like one little Shure 57 mic and, you know, a Marantz tape recorder. It was like not a very high fidelity situation. But you also learn you can make interesting stuff with very, very basic materials. One of my first longer pieces, I would say my first sort of bigger professional piece, was about the little people who live inside the radio. And it was this sort of taking this like maybe childhood little myth that there's little people who are inside, you know, some kind of radio cabinet who do all the voices. And I just imagine, well, now that it's, you know, the late 90s, what are they doing? They've been downsized. There's only one person per radio. How do they try to communicate with one another? Is there a kind of insurgent network? Could I imagine a singular character? I called her Pirate Jenny, sort of after the Brecht character. And I was like, what do they do when we turn off the radio? And I tried to imagine also the situation of like a radio that's just been stuck in the basement for 20 years. Like there's a little person stuck in there, and when you turn on the radio, how do they know what to do? So there was this whole sort of world of like, what if the technology actually involves these little like magical creatures, and what if they're attempting to communicate with one another? What does a radio world, like what does that environment sound like to them as they're like seeking others of their own kind? So I end up making this like sort of sprawling piece that went through all of these different transmission ecologies, these different environments that were like kind of abstractions of the things we recognize from radio programming.
I think that actually leads really well, especially it kind of seems like you were more or less inspired by not the death but the dying of radio in a way there. What kind of you think like the future of these softwares and the entire audio workspace is? Do you think it's gonna become more kind of alienated from its roots? Do you think there's been so little change over time that you don't think it'll change? Or even do you think there's, I've noticed this personally, that there's this kind of nostalgic revival for hardware? Or do you think that's going to be reintroduced as this significant thing in the future?
I mean, I think, at least as we were talking about in terms of making guitar pedals and synthesizers and modulars, I mean, there was this huge spike in that, and there's lots of people who now have an entire practice built around like playing with hardware objects again. I mean, when I see DJs, they're not generally using records anymore. It's a lot more of these sort of MIDI kind of turntable devices that then allow you to gesturally affect like digital files you have on your computer. So I don't think that's really going anywhere most of the time. Like there's a much smaller subset of people who are still going to DJ and kind of engage in turntablism with actual records and record players. But I think the interest and the delight in hardware continues, and it's in part because it's also performatively more interesting that someone's twisting a knob than it is that they're just staring at their laptop. I do think AI is a bigger and bigger component to all of this. I mean, as all of these DAWs evolve, there are subtle forms of AI that are present. You know, for instance, a denoiser becomes more and more sophisticated. And that's just about like highlighting an area. The AI identifies what all of the elements are that are in that area and then says, okay, I will denoise a file based on this sort of information you've given me.
Is a denoiser always AI, more or less? Or it's at least an algorithm, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is funny. There was some.
I mean, it's like primitive AI or whatever you might say.
I heard some people complaining during break today about not liking Pro Tools because it doesn't have a denoiser. I don't know if that's true or not, but
you have to pay for it as a separate plugin, so it's like a bigger investment to get the fancy denoiser.
But the denoiser is more or less it's kind of a it's a shortcut from what I understand.
Yeah.
Like you can do that if you know what you're doing with EQ, right?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. So I in
Where the AI comes in is there are some that are quite sophisticated, and so in that case, I could take a recording I've made, like let's say out on the sidewalk in front of Baskin, and I could say, all right, I know that there's a point where I hear like the bus brake release happen, and it's quite loud. So I could highlight everything right before or right after that, and teach the denoiser this is all the stuff I don't want. And then I just highlight the whole file, and the denoiser's like, okay, I already know what to cut out. I'll just eliminate that, and I'll hang on to the sound that you want right here where I see that there's, this big loud sound that you want to keep.
So one of the the big thing that I think is the reason a lot of creatives are, I don't want to say afraid, but at least don't like AI, is because it's being used to replace the actual creative aspect. But I think there are a lot of legitimate use cases, and a lot of them I think are kind of cutting workflow, like not having to manually go through an EQ like a whole file, and actually just having something be able to tone that down for you.
Sure, but there's like, okay, so this is where, for instance, with mastering, there's a lot of bitching and debate about mastering software, because some of those, like Lander, for instance, which is like it's like left and right, LANDR, Lander, and so it's created in order that you can kind of auto master or batch master, let's say, an entire album. And it's much cheaper than going to somewhere where you get the skills of someone who masters. It's basically just about manipulating EQ and so on. You can master according to a bunch of different parameters. I mean, it doesn't do the world's worst job. It's like better than no mastering. But having also worked with someone whose skill it is to master, it does actually make a difference when someone just has the feel for, like, really you got to massage that EQ here and that EQ there, and like the AI is always going to be taught on a set of parameters, and it's generally going to look for a median solution for something, where someone who's mastering specifically your project isn't necessarily going to look for the median solution. They're going to look for something precisely that's appropriate for your project.
So
I just think that there's, in the same way that you could, for instance, just say, all right, I have this interview, I want to like cut out these bits and those bits, you know, I still think it matters. Like, I like doing it by hand, because the timing, or the breath or the break, the tempo is something that I like massaging personally. And you can do some of those sorts of things also if you're making sample-based music. You can use, if you use Ableton or use some of these other softwares, there's a lot of automation built in there so that you don't have to work very hard to get it turned into something that like hangs on to the right BPM, follows certain sorts of modes, like it will auto crop your loops so that it exactly repeats like according to the tempo you've set up. But there's something nice about struggling a little bit with that, because it's actually those tiny little imperfections that almost make something beautiful.
I mean, I completely agree, but
it's not always that way, but it can be that way. So
I think there's like the biggest thing with AI is I think it just kind of, its biggest potential is in removing busy work, streamlining the process. In my mind, its biggest potential is doing kind of the same thing that moving to DAWs did, of just making everything easier.
Yeah.
But like you just said, just as in moving to DAWs kind of remove your contact with your work, I think there is still, there's that organic element that's lost when you're having a machine that's running purely on an average do everything.
That's right. So even think about some of the pieces we listened to today in class. If I think about like Max's piece, for instance, like it's really obvious that some of the placement of the samples that he was using, that's a really fine touch for his own ear, saying this is when this starts, not here, not there, but here. And that would be different than if he had put it into a kind of grid, like a Snap 2 grid, which he could still do with the same software. But if he'd snapped it on the same grid, it would have been repeatable on a much more machinic mode. But he allowed this like completely variable but yet repetitive set of samples to interact with each other, and it gives a very different approach than something which is a bit more regularized or normalized.
All right, I think that's a really excellent place to end here.